and it'll take me about 1 second to introduce you. And it'll take me, all right. Hi, I'm Anna Spencer, and let's go to New York, shall we? And have a good conversation at the United Nations, or very near the United Nations, about what's going on with the lawyers. I want to talk to John Burroughs, who is with the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. And his office is very near the United Nations because he is the person that interacts mostly with people at the UN about legal matters, international law regarding, especially about nuclear weapons. Good morning, John Burroughs.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to get together with you and learn a little bit because I never had a course on international law. And I do have some ideas about nuclear weapons. So I think you and I are in sync, in harmony on that issue right off the bat. Okay, so let's start off by finding out much more about your organization, the Lawyers Committee. Is it on or about or?
Yeah, the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, it was founded in 1981. So we're in our 40th anniversary. And in the 1980s, there were various leading legal scholars associated with LCNP saying, you know what? The use of nuclear weapons is contrary to international law. In fact, it would be in some circumstances a crime against humanity. This was not an approach, surprisingly, that had really been pursued except within the United Nations itself. But eventually, Lawyers Committee, LCNP I call it, played a central role in the effort to obtain an advisory opinion, successful effort to obtain an advisory opinion in 1996 from the International Court of Justice on the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And then my predecessor, Alan Ware, and others also drafted a model nuclear weapons convention, like the Chemical Weapons Convention, comprehensive, which became a UN document, was referred to by one of the Secretary Generals. So it was a fairly influential document, and it, in a funny way, sort of laid the groundwork for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
I wasn't aware of that, of the connection. Okay.
And we've done a lot of other things, published books and articles. And we were active within the United States advocacy in Washington, working with grassroots activists. But a lot of our work is focused on international law, international institutions.
Well, I take it that your biggest triumph was that advisory opinion of the World Court back in the 90s. Is that the case? That everybody was pretty excited about that at the time. I don't know whether there have been any, is there any outcome? Tell us about what that was and whether or not it has made any difference at all in the way countries proceed with their nuclear policies.
Well, the request for the advisory opinion came under standard procedure from the General Assembly. It was very contested in the General Assembly. In fact, it had to, the vote on it was delayed a year, but eventually the General Assembly asked the ICJ to give it an advisory opinion, which is an authoritative interpretation of international law on the legality of threat or use of nuclear weapons. Then in 1995, there were 2 weeks of hearings in which the largest number of states to that point, more than 40, made presentations to the court. And the court struggled with the question. but eventually, months later, longer than usual, came out with an opinion in which it said that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally contrary to international law, especially law governing the conduct of armed conflict, also known as international humanitarian law, which prohibits the infliction of indiscriminate harm and unnecessary suffering. But that was by a 7-7 vote, carried by the casting vote of the president of the court, Mohammed Bajawi. There were 3 dissenters who dissented because they wanted to say that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is categorically illegal. So really, there were 10 judges out of 14 at the time who found that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is at least generally illegal.
Mhm.
There was really an unusual and unfortunate sort of caveat or gray area in the court's opinion. The court said that they could not give a view one way or the other on an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of a state is at risk. In the view of some critics, both the use of the word general, which would seem to leave open, well, there might be some limited uses which might comply with IHL, but also more importantly, this loophole that they couldn't decide in an extreme circumstance meant that the court had not really answered the question. I wrote a little book about the opinion, and my view then and my view now is that the thrust of the opinion is towards the illegality of use of nuclear weapons in typical circumstances, putting aside marginal circumstances like, you use a bomb to drop it on a submarine under the water, putting aside marginal circumstances like that. That's my view of it. But the court itself was not satisfied with the outcome concerning legality of threat or use. So they went on and answered a question they were not asked. And that was, what is the nature of the disarmament obligation? And interpreting.
Was that in the same document as their basic opinion, or was it like later they came back and did a second thought?
No, it was in the advisory opinion.
Okay.
So interpreting Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also other international law, like early General Assembly resolutions, which unanimously called for establishment of a process of nuclear disarmament. The court said there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations on nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. This conclusion was taken up enthusiastically by the General Assembly and has been voted for many years by almost all countries, leaving aside, the US, UK, France, Russia, and I think some of the US allies.
I presume all of the nuclear powers, nuclear states vote against it. Is that?
No. China, Pakistan, India vote in favor of it.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot has happened since then, and I can go on, but perhaps I should let you say something.
I really am very interested in this whole saga because you've already told me things I didn't know. So go on. Tell me how that has what has there been any impact at all on actual policies of the nuclear weapon states?
When the opinion came out, the nuclear weapon states sort of took note of it, and although they, observed the sort of gray area of the exceptional circumstance. And they also said that it's only an advisory opinion, sort of putting aside it's an authoritative opinion of the International Court of Justice. But more importantly, the advisory opinion proceedings stimulated, certainly the United States. I can't really speak to the other nuclear powers, but stimulated the United States to dig more deeply into how, in their view, they were going to bring the use of nuclear weapons, the possible use, into compliance with the law of armed conflict. And so now you see statements from high-level entities of the U.S. military, basically signed off by the Secretary of Defense, saying that U.S. use of nuclear weapons will comply with IHL. And then they say, we won't attack civilians, and any use of nuclear weapons, the collateral damage will be proportionate to the military advantage that is being sought. So if it's disproportionate, the attack will not be carried out.
Really? Is that official U.S. policy?
Yes, it is. And it tracks, U.S. policy regarding use of conventional weapons. Everybody, I think, is familiar with, the U.S. says, well, we can attack combatants or, quote, terrorists, and there can be some collateral damage and injury so long as it's not excessive in relation to the importance of the military target. So in the case of the Iraq War, 2003, and also even in the 1990s, the US would say, well, if it's a high value military target or individual, there can be, a dozen or more civilian casualties we will accept along with that attack. So they're trying to apply the same principles in the nuclear realm. So my view is that this is mistaken because it overlooks the fact, the emphasis on we don't target civilians, any attack will be proportionate to the military advantage. It overlooks the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, which is well established in international law, in particular Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. But, from their point of view, almost any nuclear attack, putting aside really marginal situations, is going to have really far-reaching effects, explosive effects, radioactive effects, etc. And so if you say that the use of nuclear weapons will comply with the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, you're basically ruling out the use of nuclear weapons. So they don't rely on that principle.
My God, you've really stunned me because I thought I knew my way around the whole nuclear doctrine, and nothing that I know about the plans for, any kind of attack includes any consideration about reducing the effects on civilians or you're talking about ICBM set up to obliterate all the cities in another continent. What kind of proportionality could there possibly be?
Exactly. Exactly.
The whole plan is it's Armageddon. It's really, once that thing is started, there's no limitation on, you can't count on any kind of rules-based strategy. It would just be one big bang after another. And I think that's exactly what they plan, except that these odd little comments about, well, maybe we could have some battlefield, tactical nuclear weapons that we could use on certain circumstances in a ground war or something like that. Then they're talking about, well, maybe let's have some kind of mini nukes, or maybe the size of a Hiroshima bomb or something. And then those are, in themselves, that whole discourse is distressing, because it opens the doors to God knows what. It's to talk about any use of nuclear weapons becomes an appalling entry. So here I am ranting, but I'm so shocked that there is an official policy of proportionality and not trying to injure civilians, when everything I know about the real plans are completely contrary to that. So excuse me for my shock.
Yeah, no, well, I agree with what you've been saying, but this statement that the US is going to adhere to the law of armed conflict has found its way into recent nuclear posture reviews, including the 2017 nuclear posture review released under the Trump administration. So it has been integrated in a certain fashion into U.S. Nuclear planning. But as you say, if the U.S. says there are high value military targets, for instance, another side's, an enemy's nuclear weapons capabilities, then in their approach would be to accept very high, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties in order to achieve that military objective, if it's something so significant as disarming the other side's nuclear weapons capabilities. As you say, there's also, this has been going on for decades, but it's been more prominent, I think, in recent years. There are certainly those planners in the US, and I think in Russia too, who think there could be limited uses of nuclear weapons, which partly, would presumably serve to signal, back off. We are prepared to resort to use of nuclear weapons against your homeland if it comes to that. So these are two sort of dynamics. And, looking at it from the point of view of somebody who has spent a good part of my life talking about the International Court of Justice opinion and related international law, I am concerned that we're seeing a process of paradoxically sort of turning international law constraints into a kind of legitimizing role for nuclear planning. I'm talking in particular about the United States. That could lead to some, and would lead to some limits, but it also could serve to sort of reassure the military and others that it's legitimate what the US is doing. It complies with the law of armed conflict.
So these limitations that you've described about trying to limit the effects on civilians, and proportionality to the risk, those could be brought out as arguments indicating that they are in compliance with basic international law, and that they are proper, they're not doing war crimes. Is that the idea, that this may be used as a legitimating argument?
Yes, but it leaves out the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks that I mentioned earlier. It leaves out prohibition of causing severe and irreversible harm to the environment. It leaves out affecting the human rights and the right of people around the world who would be affected by radiation, depending on the situation. It leaves out the rights of neutral states. So it is a very narrow approach to integrating international law into U.S. nuclear planning.
Okay, but now these limitations that you say where did they come from? They must have been appended to whatever nuclear policy they existed after the World Court decision was released. Is that true, or was this a reaction to the World Court decision, or had they been claiming that all along and Metta Spencer just wasn't paying attention?
My understanding of it is that it was a process that was greatly accelerated by, first of all, the U.S. made extensive arguments before the International Court of Justice, explaining how certain uses of nuclear weapons would or might comply with the law of armed conflict. But then I think that those arguments and the ICJ's opinion itself stimulated a move towards integrating international law of armed conflict into U.S. Nuclear planning in subsequent years.
Okay. So, but I don't hear about this. I mean, really, it's not that I'm completely oblivious to these discussions, and we do not hear about that caveat or that supposed limitation in nuclear doctrine.
Well, the nuclear posture reviews are the most public documents or the most known documents, and they just have a sentence or two about the U.S. will comply with law of armed conflict. They don't really explain it.
Well, do they? What do they say about Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
No.
I mean, well, would anybody try to pretend that those two instances fell within the limitations that they claim they have now? In other words, would they say that not too many civilians were injured and that it was proportional to the amount of risk, military, the value of the military target?
This is, not something that I've seen the U.S. government discuss. There's sort of silence on this subject. But I think you would see different responses to your question depending on, international lawyers and political scientists within the government or outside the government. For example, there's a piece by Scott Sagan, a Stanford political scientist, and a co-author, his name I'm not remembering at the moment, had been in the State Department Office of Legal Counsel. And their article sort of conveys that international law has developed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And under international law, as it stands today, those bombings would be illegal. I think they were illegal at the time, and that's what the Tokyo court said in the early 1960s in the Shimoda case.
Okay. Well, has anybody ever tried to say, okay, let's take it to the ICC? I mean, to the World Court. Why? I guess that's where we would take it. Sure. So has anybody actually said, well, let's work on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and establish that was from the get-go?
Well, this is a pretty significant court that gave that ruling in Japan, but no, I'm not aware of any effort within an international tribunal. So I've given you a sort of a kind of a mixed picture about the development of law of armed conflict applied to nuclear weapons since the ICJ opinion. But there are other more positive things. First of all, the effort to apply international law to nuclear weapons really got a boost from the International Committee of the Red Cross starting in around 2010. The International Committee came out with a resolution stating that it is hard to conceive of any use of nuclear weapons that could comply with international humanitarian law. This, and then the International Committee of the Red Cross was a central player, really, in the humanitarian consequences conferences that preceded the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And, you know, if you look at the preamble, which is a marvelous preamble to the TPNW, it includes a paragraph setting forth principles of international law and another paragraph saying that the states concluding the treaty consider that any use of nuclear weapons would violate international humanitarian law and international law. So that's one strand. Another strand is that the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and my organization and Swiss Lawyers for Nuclear Disarmament participated in the process leading up to this finding. In 2018, they released a general comment on the right to life set forth in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in paragraph 66, it's a long comment, so I'll mention the paragraph. The committee says that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is incompatible with respect for the right to life and may amount to a crime under international law. And it goes on to say there's an obligation to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons, and there's an obligation to provide compensation to victims of nuclear testing and use of nuclear weapons. So it's very much sort of in line with the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So there's been...
Which committee did you say produced this document?
UN Human Rights Committee. It's the committee that is sort of the body associated with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is one of the three main international human rights instruments.
Okay. Oh, now, okay. How much leverage does a thing like that have? Does it make any impact in, say, the Pentagon?
Well, not that is visible so far. To me, the importance of the human rights approach is that it's universal law. It's concerns rights owed to individuals. It connects with human security. So it's sort of an avenue for saying what is also common sense, that, reliance on nuclear weapons is incompatible, it's contrary to the rights of individuals all over the world. So it's not just a matter of states and governments. They aren't the only owners of international law, so to speak.
Okay, now let's move on to the next big achievement in international law, the TPNW. And now, no, I guess there's an intermediate stage, this thing about this model covenant, which I'm not quite sure what the connection is between that covenant and the TPNW, but maybe you can elucidate.
forgive me, but I would like to say one more thing about the consequences of
Mm,
advisory opinion. And, as I mentioned, it had a very strong statement of the obligation to negotiate elimination of nuclear weapons. And that was taken up within the United Nations General Assembly. And in 2014, the Marshall Islands, where some 60 nuclear tests had been carried out by the United States in the 1950s, led by its incredible foreign minister, Tony DeBruym, who was also a key player in the climate negotiations. The Marshall Islands filed lawsuits in the International Court of Justice against all 9 nuclear armed countries. I had the privilege of being a member of the legal team for the Marshall Islands. 3 of those cases actually got litigated part way before the International Court of Justice, and this depended on how governments accept the jurisdiction of the court. So the cases proceeded against the UK, India, and Pakistan, but they only got to the preliminary stages. The court dismissed the cases on the ground that the Marshall Islands had not established a dispute with each of those governments prior to bringing the cases. For instance, by sending letters and having meetings. Again, this was a very, very close vote. I think it was the UK case. It was a tie vote among the judges, carried by the president of the court. But for anybody who's interested in digging into the arguments as to why the policies of nuclear armed states do not comply with the disarmament obligation in various aspects of it, the briefs that the Marshall Islands filed are on the ICJ website in the India, Pakistan, and UK cases. So those cases were dismissed in 2016.
I saw a film a guy made named Horowitz called Nuclear Savage
Yes.
about the Marshall Islands situation. It's the most tragic, and I showed it to my class when I was teaching. It's the only time I've ever cried in my own class watching that,
Yeah.
because what he seemed to have demonstrated, and I wonder whether you agree that it was clear. It looked to me like what he demonstrated was that they deliberately knew that they were going to be exposing people to radiation that would have catastrophic effects, and that there had been originally an experiment planned to use mice, and they sort of crossed out the word mice and replaced it with Marshallese people or something. I don't remember. He showed a document. Am I distorting reality? My memory was, this is the most appalling evidence I have ever seen of a deliberate intention to do war crimes.
There's a really terrible story about how there were Marshallese who had been exposed to radiation as a result of the nuclear explosions carried out by the US. And they were brought to the United States and studied. And they were treated poorly in the course of doing that. And certainly there are allegations that the US military, in effect, deliberately planned these exposures. It's not something that I have dug into, but it's clear that the US was recklessly indifferent to the effects on Marshallese in carrying out these nuclear explosions.
Well, I think my understanding of this thing, and I shouldn't be talking about something without having watched that show. I can't find it. I have lost the DVD. But he showed that I thought that there were plans to actually do deliberate experiments on mice to see what the effects of radiation would be. And then someplace along the way, they changed it to people, and they actually planned this big, was it the Bravo explosion that had the biggest impact on the population? So that
Yes.
they knew that the wind was going to blow the way it was going to go, and they knew what they were doing. They claimed that it was all a big accident, but that people got exposed, but that in fact it was part of the plan. Now I may have to edit this out because I'm not sure I'm telling the truth, but that's the way I recall it. And if I can find it, I wish I could find the DVD because I want to watch it again.
Yeah, well, I'm aware of these allegations, but I haven't really examined it.
Okay, well, let's go on to talk about the covenant. You say Alan Ware was involved in writing the thing?
Yes, this was the model convention on the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. And Alan Ware, Merav Datan, who at the time was working, this was like 1996, 1997, working for a Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. Jürgen Schäffrin from the International Network of Engineers and Scientists Against Proliferation. They were the principal drafters, but there were many others involved in the drafting. I even played a minor role. And as I mentioned, this was based on the approach taken by the Chemical Weapons Convention, which has is a long treaty, has very specific verification requirements, which has enforcement and compliance provisions and so on. So it was the model Nuclear Weapons Convention was similar in its comprehensiveness. And it was an important document, and it was taken up by, in effect, by Malaysia and other countries. They sponsored a resolution in the General Assembly following up on the ICJ's conclusion regarding the disarmament obligation and calling for negotiation of a nuclear weapons convention. They didn't, mention the model convention per se. I think in later resolutions it was, but the model convention definitely entered into UN deliberations. The US, UK, France, and Russia were not interested in negotiating a comprehensive approach on global elimination of nuclear weapons. So it never got traction, it never became an agenda item that was acted upon in the Conference on Disarmament and so on. And
Okay, well, if the ICJ said you guys have to immediately or sometime seriously start negotiating, what is the explanation that the nuclear states give for the fact that they haven't done a darn thing in response?
well, you know it very well, Meta. You'll know it when you hear it from me. We've reduced stockpiles by 2/3 since their Cold War highs. We're pursuing a step-by-step approach to nuclear disarmament, which will take a long time, and the like.
Mhm. Yeah, well, you're right. And I should have exactly realized that is the argument. But could the court have said, yeah, you have 2 years in which to get down to business? Could they say, put a deadline or something and saying, how timely, what do you mean by in a hurry? Step on it.
Well, the court did not actually give any sort of indication regarding.
I know, but could they have? What would have happened if they? Would it have been a reasonable thing for them to do?
No, not unless they had some basis in a treaty saying it should be accomplished by by X date or within a reasonable period of time.
Mhm. Okay. All right. So we move on, and this model convention or model treaty has been sitting there for anybody who's interested in looking, but not many people have taken a look at it, apparently. And at least the powers that be have not.
Mhm.
So then we move on to the TPNW. Uh, now we have a real treaty, but of course the nuclear states are not interested. Where do we go from here? And let's talk about what are the implications of even having such a treaty? Why is it better? Why are we better off now having what we do have than what we didn't have a few years ago?
Yeah. Well, let me first talk a little bit about the origins of the TPNW because it's interesting. It relates to what we've been talking about. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons was the civil society organization, was founded in, I don't know, 2007, 2008. And they were originally supporting the negotiation of a comprehensive convention in which the nuclear armed states would participate. But that approach was not being taken up by the nuclear armed states or most of them. And so I can change to an approach of we should negotiate a simpler treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, whether or not the nuclear armed states and their allies participate. And in taking this approach, they and interested diplomats and activists from other weapons efforts were influenced by the negotiation of the treaties prohibiting cluster munitions and landmines, both of which had major civil society involvement, and both of which were, simpler treaties than, for instance, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty or the Chemical Weapons Convention. So those efforts served as an inspiration for the TPNW. I would just note regarding landmines and cluster munitions that those are weapons that have been used in many countries
Mhm.
and have been or could be used by many countries. So having an approach where you didn't necessarily have the major powers on board clearly made sense with landmines and cluster munitions. And certainly in the case of landmines, it has definitely affected the approach of countries like the United States that have not joined the treaty. United States, as I understand it, has stopped the manufacture of landmines, and so it's definitely had an effect. So these were some of the strands that came together in the negotiation of the TPNW, which also avowedly took an approach of we are not going to talk about security of states. We are not going to talk about nuclear deterrence. We are going to talk about what are the consequences, the humanitarian consequences of using these weapons, which had also been an approach taken with landmines and cluster munitions. And there were 3 humanitarian consequences conferences in Norway, which later dropped out of the effort, Mexico, and Austria in 2013, 2014. So all this led up to the negotiation. There were other aspects, but I won't go into them, of the TPNW in 2017 at the UN here in New York. And I was there. In fact, I served as an expert on panels of the negotiations sponsored by the president of the negotiations. So I have a good sense of what it was all about. And so you asked me, well, where does it go from here? The TPNW is a marvelous statement of the political, moral, and legal principles that should guide the abolition of nuclear weapons. One way you could think about it is there has been, development of norms, as we say. There has been discussion about the horrors of nuclear weapons and the need to abolish them in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, since the 1950s. In a certain way, the TPNW was saying, let's take this discussion out of the UN building and let's get it out in the world where the world can see it and hopefully join in. So now there are something like 56 state parties to the TPNW, and it entered into force beginning of this year. The first meeting of states parties is going to take place in March in Vienna. So I think it sort of remains.
This coming year in March?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I think it sort of remains to be seen over years and even decades exactly what the impact and role of the TPNW is going to be. One thing that's very specific, that the TPNW has provisions, the first provisions in international instruments related to nuclear weapons, saying that there's an obligation to provide assistance to victims of nuclear testing and use. And there's also an obligation to environmentally remediate areas affected by nuclear testing and use. Well, these are issues on which states parties can move, whether or not the nuclear armed states and their allies join. So I think that's going to be a subject of live discussion at the first meeting of states parties.
Well, I know the U.S. was putting pressure on various states not to sign the thing, and I don't know how much impact they had. Did they manage to discourage any country enough so that they actually did not endorse it? And is there still any? What will happen in the future in terms of U.S. pressure on countries that have signed it and are in compliance?
The rate of ratification of the TPNW has been slower than was expected or hoped, and this is stated quite clearly in a book about the treaty written by one of the leading diplomats in its creation. That's Alexander Komet of Austria. How much the lobbying of the US and also France, at least, and perhaps other nuclear armed states affected states' decisions about signing and ratifying the treaty, I don't know. But I think it probably had some effect. South Africa, for instance, did ratify the treaty, a one-time nuclear possessing state, and indicated that they had overcome some rather serious pressure in order to do that. The US under the Biden administration has now said they're not going to be asking or pressuring governments not to participate as observers at the first meeting of states parties. So that's a good sign. Whether they are continuing to ask or pressure countries not to sign or ratify the treaty, I don't know.
Well, here in Canada, we worry all the time about how come Canada is so cowardly, and clearly the majority of the Canadian population would like to get rid of nuclear weapons. In fact, that's true for every country in the world, as far as I can tell. I believe polls have shown,
Yes.
that every country I think there was only exception was once briefly Israel and another time Pakistan. Just slightly under 50% of the population said they wanted to nuclear disarmament. But apart from that, most countries are well above 50%, and some up to 80% in favor of nuclear disarmament. So if the people want it, but they just don't seem to want it enough to make a big noise. We just had an election, and of course, it never came up as part of the election campaigns. And so, I mean, my guess is that probably the US didn't even have to bother to intimidate Canada, because Canada intimidates itself by feeling, that we're part of NATO and therefore we can't sign it. By the way, what's your opinion about whether or not a NATO member could endorse the TPNW?
Well, first of all, it is true that there is popular pressure or at least support in a number of US nuclear allies for those governments to join the TPNW. But there's been no movement in that direction. And if a government joins the TPNW, they are categorically disassociating themselves from nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons cannot be used in their defense by a country outside the treaty, and they cannot assist or participate in any way in nuclear planning, etc. Certainly advocates of the TPNW, like analysts associated with ICAN, say it is possible to join the TPNW and still be in, for example, NATO, but it would require very, very serious carving out from sort of standard NATO processes and procedures. Mm-hmm. It would also mean, and this is important, this isn't just a matter of paper, it's a matter of actual practice. Canadians can inform me about this, but my impression is that Canada remains rather deeply integrated in US nuclear and military planning and preparation, not so much for use of the weapons per se, but for example, the early warning systems. Is that true?
Well, I don't know. They used to have all these radar stations and things in the far north. I don't even know whether those are needed anymore with satellites. So the current status of early warning, I really am not. That's a real technical question that I couldn't answer. Mm-hmm. I've heard people argue that Canada or any other NATO country could sign the TPNW, but couldn't ratify it until they had done something like lobby within NATO to change NATO's nuclear policy. And then, if they were actively within NATO trying to get the policy changed, that then they could ratify it. I don't know how much they'd have to do. It sounded to me as if it would really amount to, as you say, carving out their participation and saying we will have nothing to do with any nuclear.
Right. Well, the rule is once you sign a treaty, you're supposed to act in accordance with its object and purpose. So that's very clear if you talk about something like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. If you sign the treaty, clearly you cannot conduct a nuclear test. And conservative international lawyers like John Bolton have accepted that understanding of US signing of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and therefore called for the US to unsign the treaty. Now, in the case of the TPNW, it has fairly wide-ranging prohibitions. You're prohibited from developing, possessing nuclear weapons, using, threatening to use them, but you're also prohibited from assisting with nuclear weapons
Mhm.
or inducing or encouraging use of nuclear weapons. So it's not something I've delved into,
Mhm.
but I'm doubtful that a government could join could sign the TPNW and uh, and then just ask NATO, please change your policies. I think it would have to be more than that.
Mhm. Okay, one would hope so, even in fact. But
Yeah,
now, what are the prospects of getting more, either more countries signing or getting more action? My impression is that the TPNW came and went in the US without the slightest attention being given in the press, that the Americans don't even know such a thing exists on the whole. I'm an American, by the way, I'm a dual citizen, but is that the case? Do you have the impression that the US is totally indifferent to the whole damn thing? Or is there an effort to keep people from knowing about it?
of course, peace activists are well aware of it and are advocating about it. And there is a resolution in the US Congress, which a proposed resolution sponsored by a few members of Congress, like uh, uh, Congressmember Raskin, which essentially calls for the US to act in accordance with the TPNW and eventually to join it. So there is some activity, but of course you're right. It's not like a headline in the US, and nuclear issues generally are not don't get all that much attention in US mainstream media.
Mhm. Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left to talk about the nuclear policy review that's, I presume, underway in the Pentagon now. I
Yes.
heard some disquieting news a couple of days ago that the a woman that had been appointed to that, to be party to that whole planning exercise, has been squeezed out by the Hawks. And that this is bad news, because I believe that before being elected, that Biden had said that he was in favor of this, what is called sole purpose, which is almost the same as, or maybe really the same as the no first use policy. So what is your sense, if you are aware of any goings on in Washington, about what do you think is this a bad sign that probably the Hawks are writing the nuclear policy review on their own terms, and that Biden will be more or less constrained to promote it as they give it to him?
Yes, it is bad news that her name is Leonore Tamero, that she was moved out of the nuclear posture review. Um, However, the president signs off on the nuclear posture review. Obama got, and White House staffers got involved in crafting the 2010 nuclear posture review. So the White House at a certain point can take control of the nuclear posture review. And obviously, the White House has a lot else on its plate,
Mhm.
but still, I think there's a chance, and probably a good chance, that they will take hold of it, and uh, it'll be important how this discussion about sole purpose comes out. Uh, the language gets a little tricky, but the way that Biden himself personally, back when he was vice president, had, or candidate for office, had supported the policy of sole purpose, was framed in a way is that it was really a no first use policy, because it basically said we would only consider the use, or we would only use nuclear weapons in retaliation. So that seems to rule out preemptive use of nuclear weapons, which other versions of sole purpose would allow. So there's still a chance for the White House to take control of this.
Mhm. Well, bless them. Let's give them every bit of approval we can. What would you say in terms of strategy for peace activists around the world to try to promote the prospects for the TPNW? How can we proceed best? What's the problem? What can we do most effectively to advance it?
Well, in the case of the TPNW, ICANN does an excellent job of campaigning. So, support the efforts of ICANN affiliates in your country. But, the problem of nuclear weapons, unfortunately, is broader than the fate of the TPNW. It requires having a global society that is less based on competition among major states and more based on cooperation and common security. And, that's what we need to move towards.
Indeed. Well, that is a glowing recommendation, which I think everybody can heartily endorse. This has been such a good conversation, John. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Yeah, I hope it's
I
helpful.
feel much smarter having talked to you now.
Well, good.
Thanks so much. Okay.
Yeah. All
Bye.
righty. Bye-bye.